Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to day two. We had an amazing day yesterday. I think there were some amazing conversations that happened. Welcome back. I'm going to turn the mic over to my colleague, Professor Jennifer Scheper-Hughes of the University of California, Riverside, and she's going to introduce and moderate our panel this morning, the first panel.
Thank you, Charlene, and good morning, all. How is everyone doing this morning? Yay, yes, ready and looking forward to the conversations that we're going to be having today, building on the rich dialogue that we started yesterday. So I'm here to introduce the morning participants, the morning papers. And the topic of the panel this morning is missions in global context. And so we welcome three speakers this morning, and I'll introduce them all at once, and then they can come up one at a time and present their papers. So we're going to begin with Professor Gauvin Alexander Bailey, who holds the position of professor and Alfred and Isabel Bader Chair in Southern Baroque Art at Queen's University. He earned his PhD at Harvard in 1996, and since then has won many awards, including grants from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada, the Guggenheim Fellowship, the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy in Rome, the Renaissance Society of America, among others. He's currently finishing his 10th book and lectures broadly and globally. He's given over 100 talks. In 2017, he was the recipient with his graduate student of an NIH grant to launch the Colonial Architecture Project, which includes thousands of high-quality photographs of colonial architecture, including images of the California missions. And these are accessible via a website that he has developed. And if time allows, in the very last 10 minutes or so of our time together in this morning session, we'll have a chance for him to show us that resource, which is an important resource for us. He's also very recently, been named a correspondent of the Institut de France, so we congratulate him on that. His presentation today is entitled A Bavarian Pilgrimage Shrine in 17th-Century Paraguay, and so we welcome Dr. Bailey. Thank you. All three? Oh, all three, yes. Okay, I'm sorry. I did promise all three. But okay, I got through the first one. I'm feeling relieved. Okay, all right. So the second speaker is Ramón de Santiago, who's a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, studying under Sugata Ray. His research focuses on the trans-Pacific transfer of visual and material culture between South Asia and Latin America in the early modern period, with a particular interest and emphasis in pre-colonial systems of trade in both regions. His theoretical interests include questions of historiography in transoceanic systems and visual and material practices. Recently, he was one of the organizers of the joint UC Berkeley-Stanford Graduate Student Symposium. His talk today is entitled Visual Globalism and 18th-Century Tabernacle from the Philippines in Mission Dolores. And last but not least, our third speaker on this panel is Joanne Mancini of Maynooth University in Ireland, where she holds the position of Associate Professor in History. She's a historian of the US and early America, with a particular interest in the intersection between American, world, and imperial history. She's held a number of prestigious grants from the Smithsonian, the Getty Research Institute, the Huntington Library, the Paul Mellon Center, and the AHRB in the UK. In 2002, she won the American Studies Association Yasuo Sakakibara Prize, followed in 2008 by the Smithsonian's Charles Eldridge Prize for Outstanding Scholarship in American Art. In 2012, her essay on California missions, Pedro Cambon's Asian Objects, A Trans-Pacific Approach to 18th Century California, won the Smithsonian American Art Museum Patricia and Philip Frost Essay Prize. Her latest book, published in 2018, is Art and War in the Pacific World, Making, Breaking, and Taking from Anson's Voyage to the Philippine-American War, and that's with our very own University of California Press. Her talk this morning is entitled Art, Architecture, and Conquest, A Trans-Pacific Perspective, and she also has, or would be happy to discuss over the course of the day, a current project titled Conflict, Objects, Restitution of the Future of Art History. So thank you and welcome to our three speakers.
Thank you very much for that introduction. And I would also like to thank Charlene and Sean for making this wonderful conference possible, and to the Chicano Studies Research Center. In 1697, the Jesuit missionary, playwright, and musician Anton Sepp von Reinig from Kalten in South Tyrol became the first German speaker to found a mission in the fabled Jesuit Republic of Paraguay, the Guarani reduction or reducción of San Juan Bautista, east of the river Uruguay, now in Brazil. A coup for German Catholics, this event led to the publication of two bestsellers. The first with Anton Böhm, Reichsbeschreibung, printed in Nuremberg in 1696, and the sequel by Sepp alone, called Continuation oder Fortsetzung, Ingolstadt, 1710, which combined swashbuckling adventure stories with descriptions of missionary work and made repeated comparisons with Germany to familiarize readers with the vast Antipodean land, as he put it, larger than all German, Netherlandish, French, and Italian provinces put together. A third, unpublished book, now in an archive in Munich, called Paraguayische Blumengarten, or Paraguayan Flower Garden, 1714, survives in fragmentary manuscript form. The books were considered ideal motivational tracts for young men preparing for pastoral or missionary work, and they were stocked in Jesuit libraries throughout Bavaria and beyond, including novitiates and houses of probation. Patriotic feelings ran high. At times, Sepp's books seemed to be as much about the victory of Germanic Moors as about Christian conversion. Sepp was especially proud that Spain relied upon ethnic Germans to man the missions rather than the French, about which he said, "the only nation hated and prohibited in Spain," unquote. Upon setting foot in Paraguay for the first time in May 1691, Sepp and Böhm even erected a cross with the words Germania emblazoned upon it, as if they were conquistadors rather than priests. Sepp sought to instill his Christian colony, and he used that word colony, with a specifically German character, linking it with his homeland through music, sculpture, architecture, and even medicine. He adorned his new church with an altarpiece inspired by one in the Jesuit novitiate in Landsberg am Lech in Bavaria, and a pulpit based on one in Augsburg. And he taught Guarani musicians to play German-style instruments, including the first pipe organ on the missions. However, the clearest symbol of Germanic identity was the octagonal cemetery chapel, a replica of the Gnadenkapelle or Heilige Kapelle, Holy Chapel, of Altötting, 91 kilometers northeast of Munich, and arguably the most important pilgrimage site in the German-speaking world. Scholars have long known about Sepp's simulacrum of the Altötting Chapel. In 2006, in fact, a German priest even reconstructed it across the road from the mission's paltry ruins. But no one has asked why Sepp chose that particular shrine. The decision to promote the Gnadenkapelle and its miraculous image called Gnadenfigur of the Virgin and Child was very deliberate. Its rich range of historical, political, and spiritual associations made it the perfect centerpiece for a German mission in the New World. Sepp's first motivation was political. He belonged to the Jesuit province of Germania Superior, headquartered in Munich, the seat of the Wittelsbach family of electors of Bavaria. Altötting was the shrine where the Wittelsbach family buried the hearts of their deceased, and they lavished its interior with silver and gold decoration, including a 1645 silver tabernacle commissioned by Maximilian I and a life-size sculpture known as the Silver Prince of 1716, given by Max III Joseph. In 1581, they founded the Archconfraternity of Our Lady of Altötting at the Munich Frauenkirche, with branches in Straubing, Rosenheim, and Altötting. A fifth confraternity was founded in Sepp's lifetime at Jetzendorf, 50 kilometers north of Munich. That was in 1713. A lavish membership book seen here from 1650 with gilded letters and the arms of the group's Wittelsbach patrons demonstrates the confraternity's importance at the electoral court. The Altötting shrine and Madonna even adorned the flags of the Bavarian infantry regiment during the 30 Years' War. Under Maximilian I's Generalleutnant Johann Zerklaes Graf von Tilly, the supreme leader of the Catholic League and a devotee of the shrine himself. The flags, captured by the Lutheran Swedes in 1631, bore an image of the Virgin and Child on a cloud and surrounded by a flaming mandorla above the shrine with its octagonal chapel, nave, tower, and surrounding arcades. More significantly, the shrine had a specifically Jesuit reference. Not surprisingly, as the Wittelsbachs had brought the Jesuits to Bavaria in the first place in 1556, and they built them the gargantuan Munich Michaelskirche, which doubled as the family pantheon, the Wittelsbach family pantheon. The first Jesuit to visit Altötting was Peter Canisius, who presided over an exorcism there in 1570. 11 years later, Duke William V sent 2 Jesuit priests and a lay brother to the town, and in 1593, before the Michaelskirche had even finished, he commissioned the Jesuit residence at Altötting and its church of St. Mary Magdalene, built behind the shrine. You can see it on the left there. It was subsequently rebuilt, so the one there is not the original. The Jesuits administered the shrine. They were its caretakers, and they promoted it ceaselessly in publications. Notably, Jakob Irsing's Divi Virginis Oettingi Historia of Munich 1663, a book Sepp certainly knew and likely brought with him to Paraguay. Copies of Irsing's book were stocked in Jesuit libraries throughout Bavaria, including at Altötting and Landsberg. Sepp also had a personal reason for favoring the shrine. In 1688 to 89, he undertook his tertianship, a 10-month final period of formation at the Altötting residence. Similarly, his fondness for Landsberg can be attributed to his time spent there at the novitiate in 1674-76. When Sepp was in Altötting, the cult's popularity had reached new heights. 4 years earlier, in 1684, an unprecedented 113,000 pilgrims visited the shrine, compared to 800 in 1593. The canons of Altötting gave Sepp a copy of the Gnadenfigur to take with him to Paraguay, allegedly including a splinter of the original inside it. Although the scholarship maintains that Sepp brought multiple copies with him, all evidence points to the contrary. Sepp took his statue to all the villages he worked in, before finally depositing it in the village of San Juan, and he always refers to it in the singular. In the Paraguayan Blumengarten, he writes of the miraculous little shrine statue of the Mother of God from Alten-Oettingen, which I brought with me from Germany. And in Continuation, he writes about the miraculous sculpture shrine, which the revered canons of Old Oettingen kindly gave to me as I departed for the Indies. Digging deeper into Altötting's past, one finds an even wider range of allegorical and symbolic associations that made it ideal for Sepp's mission. Indeed, its very legitimacy depended upon its 1,000-year history, as proudly recounted in confraternity documents. But it was the octagonal chapel, and not the cult, which enjoyed that pedigree. The Altötting octagon, built of tufa stone, has an outer diameter of about 9 meters and an inner one of 6. The exterior is only octagonal on the upper story. However, as the lower story is hidden behind this arcade, this is not apparent to the visitor, and it is usually depicted as having 8 sides on both stories. It's crowned by a semicircular dome, which is now hidden by a high wooden turret. Although scholars disagree about its date, some claiming it was built under Duke Otto in AD 572, and others dating it to the 10th or 11th century, Helga Schörne has convincingly placed the structure between 770 and 777 under the Duke Tassilo III, who also first recorded the town's name as Actum Altigas in 748. The Carolingian king, Louis the German, built his royal palace or Palatium Regium in the town in 826, using the octagon as a Palatine chapel, and his son, King Carloman, founded the adjacent collegiate church in 876, which was rebuilt in the 13th century and stands today. It was during the latter's reign, in 877, that the chapel is first mentioned, Capellum ad Oettinges. And although its dedication to the Virgin Mary was only confirmed in the 13th century, she is likely to have been the chapel's first patron, as centralized churches commonly had a Marian dedication. It is first described in 1270 as beautiful, round, and vaulted. One persistent myth is of particular relevance to the shrine's afterlife in a Latin American mission. It holds that the chapel was originally a Roman temple dedicated to the 7 planets, which was transformed into a church by Charlemagne in an act of Christian triumph over paganism. This connection was enhanced by its traditional association with St. Rupert of Salzburg, who moved to Oetting in 696 to preach the gospel to non-Christians when this region was still pagan. The Altötting shrine slightly predates the most important octagonal Palatine chapel of all, Charlemagne's Palace Chapel of St. Mary at Aachen, mid-1780s to 802, which became Charlemagne's tomb in 814. The Aachen Chapel was built on the model of the churches San Vitale in Ravenna, the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, and the Altötting Chapel likely evoked these same buildings. Louis and Carloman's use of the octagon as a Palatine chapel would also have evoked Aachen and its aura of sacral and political power, to which rulers who perceived themselves as heirs were obliged to respond. The octagonal shape was also commonly used for baptistries, as at the 4th century Neonian or Orthodox baptistry in Ravenna, and the Altötting chapel may once have served this function. In the early Middle Ages, the number 8 was also full of different associations, different Christian resonances. It related to the Sabbath, to Easter, to Pentecost, to virtue, and to Christ himself. The octagon's transformation into a pilgrimage chapel was a relatively recent development in Sepp's day. The first recorded miracle associated with the Gnadenfigur dates from 1489, a time of resurgent Marian devotion throughout southern Germany. Its new function transformed it into the building that Sepp knew, and the one represented repeatedly on battle flags and prints. As important an image of Altötting, the building, as the Gnadenfigur itself. Sometime around 1518, a nave with a high-pitched roof that we see today was added to the west of the chapel, as well as an arcaded exterior ambulatory. And in 1520, the first of now thousands of panels, ex voto panels depicting miracles, were installed in the inner wall of the gallery. Today it's almost entirely covered with these ex votos. They are layered on top of each other. In 1674, Elector Ferdinand Maria hired Italian architect Enrico Succalli to enclose this octagon in a massive Baroque complex surrounded by a square inspired by St. Peter's in Rome. However, the project was never realized. The Gnadenfigur, an early 14th century smoke-darkened limewood sculpture, depicts the Virgin standing on a small base with a crown on her head, holding the uncrowned Christ child in her right hand, and a scepter, not original and not shown in this picture, in her left. The Virgin inclines her head slightly toward the child, and the child makes the benediction with his left hand and holds an apple in his right. The Virgin wears a veil, and her dress shapes her narrow S-shaped body in elegant Gothic folds held in place by a brooch. However, these subtleties, as well as the Christ child's gestures, are usually hidden behind bulky brocaded vestments, and bejeweled crowns are usually placed on the heads of both figures. The first depictions of the Gnadenfigur bear little resemblance to the original. The earliest drawing, attributed to the master of Mühldorf in 1518 and commissioned by Maximilian I, shows her standing on an orb surrounded by 6 cherubs and wears the heavy outer garments of a cult statue, both figures lavishly adorned with chains, devotional amulets, and coats of arms, and wearing crowns and halos, in her case, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire. Raphael Sadler made the first engraving that actually looks like the original sculpture in 1607. It is set in a Gothic altarpiece with Saints Catherine and Margaret, and includes down below it that little vignette, a portrait of the chapel. So by now the Virgin and the chapel are usually shown together. She's usually associated with the building. This engraving was frequently copied, as we can see here, as in this votive plaque, as in a votive plaque I'm not showing here from 1640, but Libya Loth's frontispiece to the Confraternity book in Munich, and on the right, an engraving from Wilhelm Gumpenberg's Atlas Marianus of 1657, sort of atlas of all the Marian cult sites around Europe. A 1748 inventory of the library of the Jesuit house in Altötting confirms that it owned multiple copies of this Sadler print. It is even possible, quite possible, that Sepp brought one with him. She is also frequently represented between the shrine and the Jesuit church. But the vast majority of engravings, that's as on the right, but the vast majority of engravings date from after Sepp's death. After 1736, for example, cheap prints of the Gnadenfigur and shrine were handed out to pilgrims at a rate of about 600 a year. But the only copy of the Gnadenfigur Sepp actually mentioned was his wooden statue. Carved copies were even less common than prints. Indeed, only 10 small limewood, clay, or stone statues survive from the 15th to 17th centuries in Bavaria. And they were probably commissioned by groups such as the Altötting confraternities or as house Madonnas. They tend to follow the style of the original fairly closely, with elongated sinuous figures, flowing Gothic drapery pinned at the top with a brooch, and a very upright Christ child. Some are polychrome and partially gilded with black features. Others use whiter tones. Their heights vary from 42 to 67 centimeters, and most are attached at the bottom to a little plinth or a small box. Some may have been copied from the original directly, but none were made by the same hand, and therefore it's unlikely that there was some kind of workshop in Altötting making these copies. One scholars claim that hundreds of thousands of wooden and metal sculptures were made throughout Germany is unsubstantiated. It is therefore quite exceptional that Sepp was able to take one to South America to serve as his spiritual ambassador and as a sign of his mission's importance to Catholic Bavaria. Sepp was a true pioneer, one of the first German-speaking missionaries to Spanish America. In 1664, when there were not enough Spaniards to man their expanding missions, the Crown agreed to break their prohibition of foreign immigration and admit a trickle of non-Spanish priests. 10 years later, a third of missionary staff came from vassal states and Habsburg lands, this time including lay brothers, but not the laity. They had to be Jesuits. Sepp arrived with the first large contingent of non-Spanish Jesuits in 1691, a ship with 44 passengers, including, in his words, Spaniards, Italians, Dutch, Sicilians, Sardinians, Genoese, Milanese, Romans, Bohemians, Austrians, and I, a Tyrolean. After a brief stay in Buenos Aires, he spent 6 years in reductions on either side of the river Uruguay, including Japeyú, now Argentina, Santa Maria de Fe, now Paraguay, and San Miguel, which you see here, now in Brazil. The latter 20 kilometers to the southwest of where they would build San Juan, and the best preserved today of all the missions, although the buildings you see here are much later than Sepp's period. Founded at first to accommodate overflow population from San Miguel, San Juan Bautista became a model mission for the region, rationally planned, with a spacious grid of housing and streets, and the largest church in the reductions. It possessed an important music school and sculptural, painting, and crafts workshops of every description. Sepp attributed his safety and his success to the Virgin of Altuting, who, like him, and this is his words, crossed the giant ocean and landed in Paraguay. He likely emphasized her transoceanic voyage to associate her with Our Lady of Loreto, another flying Madonna and Child who crossed the seas, in this case the Mediterranean, to her shrine in northeastern Italy. Both Madonnas were black, and more significantly, both were identified with buildings. In Loreto's case, the Holy House of Nazareth. Significantly, Sepp had his congregation recite the Litany of Loreto in front of the statue of the Altuting Madonna, reflecting practice at Altuting itself, where the Archconfraternity recited the litany on the third day of their pilgrimage every year. The Wittelsbachs were also devoted to the Loreto cult, and in fact, the blackening of the Altuting Madonna, which Torsten Gebhardt dates to the 16th century, may have been executed intentionally to associate her with the Loreto cult. Even before founding San Juan, Sepp attributed miracles to the Virgin, especially during a plague from 1695 to 1701, in which, as he put it, the holy statue shrine, or Bildstücklein, brought from far away through so many rivers and seas to our poor land, end of quote, saved lives. As it happens, she had already proven her plague-stopping powers in Altuting in 1649. During the Paraguay plague, Sepp's statue was housed in the main church at Santa Maria de Fe, and Sepp took it into the hospital to assist in masses for plague victims. His use of the term Bildstücklein, or Bildstücklein, as he spells it in Paraguayer Blumengarten, suggested it was not simply a statue, but one mounted onto a post. And as I just mentioned, these surviving examples of the Gnadenfigur you see in Bavaria tend to be mounted on some kind of a plinth. And possibly even enclosed in its own little shrine. Such shrines are commonly found throughout southern German pilgrimage routes and in churchyards. Although in the Latin version, he identifies it as a statua, or more ambiguously, statua et effigie, so it's somewhat unclear from his language depending on whether we read the German version or the Latin version. Like a Baroque pope, Sepp turned to spectacle and ephemera as a way of appeasing God's wrath. His description of a procession at Santa Maria to end the plague shows how much opulence he could accomplish with few materials. I mounted a general prayer meeting and procession, accompanied by all my parishioners, large and small, young and old. I carried the little miracle-working statue shrine out into my fields, a half-hour distant from the village. The musicians at the beginning of the procession sang the usual litany. On the way, we said the rosary out loud. The men and little boys went ahead. The women followed behind with the little girls. The boys at the front scattered the path with various flowers, which the nearby fields provided here and there for their innocent hands. Meanwhile, at the place of repose or location where the little holy image would have to be placed, a little green wilderness hut or tiny chapel was already constructed from various triumphal arches. The surrounding trees made an agreeable shade with their branches. Considerate flora beautifully laid out a meadow instead of velvet rugs or carpets. The little boys and girls with Marian rosaries in their hands and floral wreaths on their heads accompanied me to the place where I put down the miraculous little statue and had the musicians perform the Litany of Loretto. The term he uses for the temporary chapel is Laubhütten, which was the word used in the 18th century to describe the Jewish sukkah in the 18th century in that period. And it evokes a shrine in the wilderness. His word for its grassy setting, Matten, is associated specifically with the Bavarian shrine of Altötting, which was called in Bavarian dialect, Die uralt heilige Kapelle unserer lieben Frau auf der grünen Matten, which translates as the ancient holy chapel of our beloved lady on the green grass. The version of Altötting's final home was a reduction of San Juan Bautista. In a theatrical gesture similar to the one in Santa Maria la Fe, Sepp led a procession of indigenous leaders and their subjects from San Miguel to the new mission site, the former mounted on richly caparisoned horses, holding scepters, all to the accompaniment of clarions, chirimías, a wind instrument, oboes, and flutes. On 14 September 1697, Sepp raised the cross and proceeded to plot out the new town, church, and residence. This church was 64 meters long, 20 meters wide, and 16 meters high. The altars, carved decoration, and sculptures were all made by Guarani artists, both locally and at neighboring missions, with more established ateliers such as San Nicolás, where, in his words, the Indians were more accomplished than any others in the art of sculpture. Also from Loreto Mission, from which he ordered 5 cedar sculptures. Later on, Sepp decided to have a workshop in his own mission, and he selected 6 people from his village to form a sculpture workshop and 10 to form a painting workshop. However, he gives no indication how they were trained or the methods they used. The cedar high altar tabernacle, containing the Gnadenfigur, was modeled after that of the Jesuit church in Landsberg, linking the 2 most important places and moments in Sepp's spiritual formation. Since the Landsberg Tabernacle, this is the church, since the Landsberg Tabernacle no longer exists, I'm going to substitute one that looks remarkably like the one in Sepp's description. And I quote again, "It was not unlike the altar commissioned by Reverend Father Wolfgang Leinberger of holy memory, while novice master of Landsberg, namely 4 angels, as well as 4 Atlantes figures supporting the heavens on their shoulders. In the middle, the miraculous statue, Bild is the term he uses, of Our Lady of Oettingen, completely gilded and overlaid with mother of pearl, appears on a royal throne between 4 beautifully made Corinthian columns, as also with the tabernacle itself, where 4 angels were completely, beautifully gilded, and their chests and tunics inlaid with mother of pearl, their wings and boots richly ornamented, mixed with false gemstones and little mirrors, so that they delightfully attract the eyes not only up front, but from afar." Remarkably, Sepp seems to have allowed his artisans to embellish his original sculpture, since most of the excellent German examples were at best very lightly gilded, and the application of mother of pearl is a Spanish technique called enconchado. In Paraguayan Blumengarten, Sepp describes the heaven, that's his word, supported by the angels and Atlantes as a niche containing, and I quote again, green foliage, fruit, grapevines, wheat sheaves, pomegranates, etc., festoons, and cornucopias, perhaps like the cornucopias at the top of this altarpiece here from Mindelheim. Sepp also commissioned a pulpit, which, as he put it, not at all unlike the pulpit in the church of St. Moritz in Augsburg, with 8 panels bearing figures of the 4 evangelists and the 4 doctors of the church, also gilded and overlaid with enconchado. Sepp knew St. Moritz from his year as a professor of rhetoric at the Jesuit College at Augsburg in 1687, when he was elevated to the priesthood, so another big moment for him. Since the pulpit and, in fact, the church of St. Moritz was destroyed in the Second World War, I cannot show you that pulpit. This is the reconstructed church today. The statue safely installed, Sepp built his simulacrum of the Gnadenkapelle in the cemetery, possibly based, I think likely based, on figure 1 shown here in Ersing's book. He writes, "When the tabernacle was completed, I proceeded to build next to the large parish church in God's field, or the cemetery of the dead Indians, as he calls it, an octagonal chapel in the form of the Holy Chapel of Old Oettingen. The cupola of cedar inside, the cupola was built of cedar inside, but the walls built of stone. And although the building does not use mortar because we don't have any around here, I therefore had the blocks of the main structure fitted on top of each other. At the top of this chapel, or cupola, I placed 8 windows in the shape or figure of an oval, through which the bright daylight shines inside very freely. The double portal is made with durable cedar, in which the sculptor's adze and chisel carved and limbed various quite realistic death's heads, including the bones. The death heads and oval windows do not appear in the original Alt-Oetting shrine, as we have seen. But Sepp's conception of what makes a replica was not ours today. It's not the modern one of an exact simulacrum, but rather of a symbolic representation based on numerical and also geometrical values, the number 8, the octagon. Sepp's chapel is also part of a wider movement in Germany to make copies of the Gnadenkapelle. In fact, if wooden simulacra of the Gnadenfigur, that's the Holy Figure, were rare, replicas of the chapel were not. In 17th and early 18th centuries, octagonal chapels were built in places like Telgte in Westphalia, now a major pilgrimage site in its own right, and throughout Bavaria, Austria, and Bohemia, including Landsberg, and sometimes even as a cemetery chapel. As oblivious to exactitude as Sepp's chapel, their styles ranged from severe at Aldenhoven to ostentatious, as we see here at Telgte. Sepp's building was more than just a cemetery chapel. He and his successors used it as a reception hall for important visitors, for VIPs, events which were accompanied by performances by Guarani musicians and dancers and all the pomp the mission could provide. As in this fiesta of 9 October 1717, 7 years after Sepp's final departure, so Sepp's already gone from the village, this was recorded by Father Betchen in a letter to the provincial of Germania Superior. So I quote this letter now. On the 9th, we embarked again, and before dusk we arrived at the chapel of Our Lady of Oettingen, built by Father Sepp. There we were received by the chiefs of the reduction of Santa Cruz, among the sounds and drums and trumpets and the rumble of shots. The Indians who had come here on horseback were all dressed in the European manner. This is how it is in the great fiestas here. Later, at Santa Cruz, the whole village praised the Most Holy Virgin Mary of Oettingen in a lively voice. What is interesting is that these events did not take place in the much more spacious church, suggesting that missionaries used this Germanic chapel to advertise the specifically Bavarian allegiance of his mission, especially to visiting Germans. This message hit home, as in a letter of 3 May 1721, when the Bavarian priest Franz Mag was moved to declare that even the main church took as an example those of Munich, even though by that time Sepp's church had been demolished. Indeed, Sepp's creation was short-lived. Already in 1714, the Jesuit provincial of Paraguay, concerned with its amateurish construction, ordered that the church be rebuilt on similar lines to that of the reduction of San Nicolás, which is now also in Brazil. Because, as he wrote, it is well known that the chapels in the plaza are close to collapsing and will be demolished as soon as possible so that no disaster happens. So much for Sepp's German engineering. The work was done by the first professional architect that reached the mission, Brother Johannes Kraus from Pilsen, present-day Czech Republic, who had arrived in 1701. The octagonal chapel initially survived the reconstruction. As just noted, it was still being used in 1717. However, no trace appears in two detailed mid-century maps of the reduction drawn up at the time when the territory was transferred to Portugal, and which described the buildings as being new and therefore even later than Kraus's reconstruction. Barely 60 years after its foundation, Sepp's Germanic Paragon had become an ordinary Spanish-style mission. In 1733, Sepp died at the San Jose reduction, now in Argentina. 225 kilometers away from San Juan, certainly aware of the loss of his church, and paradoxically for the aging patriot, barely able to speak German anymore. When the Jesuits were expelled from Spanish territories in 1767, the government inventory of the church made no mention of a Virgin of Altötting, only noting two images of the Most Holy Virgin in the church, one of them a Virgin of the Rosary, and a third, in the cemetery chapel, a Virgin of Sorrows. Only one possible copy of the Gnadenfigur may exist, an unidentified, mutilated wooden sculpture at neighboring San Miguel. It's in the San Miguel Museum today, and it's on the far right in this slide. It depicts a female figure with a crown on her head and heavy flowing drapery, her left arm broken off above the elbow, and her right arm broken off just below the wrist. Given the width of the break in the left arm, it is possible that she once held the Christ child, which means that it is a reverse of the original. So let's do that. In which she holds the child in her right arm. Paraguayan sculptors tended to alter their models by making them more erect and frontal, and by animating the drapery so that its folds gather into expressive patterns. They also often reversed the original image, since artists probably used an optical instrument like the pantographia, designed by the Jesuit scientist Christoph Scheiner, which used mirrors to reflect an object or engraving onto a sheet of paper in reverse. Sepp mentions that his indigenous artists used a model, he used the term musta, and that they displayed an extraordinary aptitude for copying. But he does not say, typically, how that copying was achieved. If this little sculpture is indeed the Virgin of Altötting, and the jury is really out, it is a meager remnant indeed of what was once the most vaunted and advertised symbols of Germanic missionary triumph in the history of South America. Thank you.
So thank you very much for that. We will continue now with Ramón de Santiago's talk, Visual Globalism, an 18th Century Tabernacle from the Philippines at Mission Dolores. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I want to thank Professor Charlene Villaseñor-Black, the Terra Foundation for American Art, and the University of California at Los Angeles, and the kind organizers of this conference for giving me the opportunity to present alongside such incredible and inspiring scholars. I also want to take a moment to thank my wife. This is the first time she's had the pleasure of seeing me present in public, although she has had to endure every second of my grinding and neurotic creative process. Thank you for your patience and affection. The 18th century Philippine Tabernacle, currently in the sacristy of Mission Dolores in San Francisco, belongs to the histories of the California missions, but also to an art history of motion, desire, and consumption. Beyond its abilities to fulfill the functions of its purpose and the requirements of its design, it announces itself in multiple visual and material voices, some of those voices declarative and others more tentative. Here we see the painted ceiling of the mission with colors and designs reflecting the Ohlone visual culture. The mission's deep relationship and impact on the indigenous community of the Ohlone runs parallel with the histories of landscape and architecture. The resilience of the Ohlone peoples marks time with the persistence of the mission in San Francisco. New histories emerge as old narratives are analyzed, as soils are tilled to let grow what was once there from the very beginning. Through an examination of the Mission Dolores Tabernacle's form and design, I offer that it not only resonates along its paths of mobility in the transoceanic trade, but that it also generates the possibility of altering ideas of globalism in the early modern world of trans-Pacific exchange. Before I begin my discussion of the Tabernacle, I would like to weave some ideas together based on my research of early modern Mexican history. Vasco de Quiroga arrived in Mexico City in 1530 with a humanist vision coupled with a religious mission of converting the indigenous populations of New Spain. In the span of 4 years, he established 2 communities named Hospital Pueblo de Santa Fe in order to protect and minister to the vulnerable and abused communities in the Valley of Mexico. Quiroga modeled these safe havens for the Indians on the basis of one of his most favorite books, apart from the Bible, a book titled Utopia by Thomas More, published in 1516. For Quiroga, the idea of an island for the native communities proved an alluring project to build a self-sustaining, independent community where souls could be saved through the crafting of objects and surrounded by mutual ambitions of giving glory to God. Though these protected communities seemed to offer safety and salvation, they were in fact compounds of sequestration, not quite prisons, but also not the utopian islands of a humanist impulse. I argue that Quiroga's vision, a transoceanic ideal brought to New Spain from Europe, is the seed for what later becomes the mission project of the church throughout New Spain, which culminates eventually in Alta California. It seems that no one told Vasco de Quiroga that Thomas More meant utopia as a satire, one that made fun of mendicant orders and the isolated lives of religious brotherhoods. Domingo Francisco de San Anton Muñoz Chimalpain Cuetlahuanantzin was a 16th century writer and historian. A prolific chronicler of his experience in Mexico City, here we see a page in Nahuatl of his accounts of witnessing the arrival of the Japanese delegations into Mexico City, one in 1610 and the other 4 years later. The delegations for Chimalpain were not only evidence of the reach of the church's mission in Asia, but also for a vision of a distant place that he confounded as a trans-Pacific Asia where Japan, Manila, and China occupied a conceptual mutual geography. This account is important because it reflects Chimalpain's attempt to process the visual and material bodies of the Japanese representatives through Nahuatl, the indigenous language of the Mexica, or the Aztecs as more commonly known. The ornate designs of their clothes, the smoothness and shine of the skin of their faces, the textures and colors of their hair are all translated through Nahuatl terminology. Visual and material qualities become inflected and recalibrated through the visual and material vocabularies that evoke shades of jade, the qualities of soil, the reflections and scintillations of hummingbird feathers. Chimalpine localizes Asianness through a language of terms born from the people of the Valley of Mexico. This painting of Don Juan Velasco is a posthumous portrait of an 18th century elite member of the royal court in New Spain. This visual eulogy of a body set against a deep shadow and framed by rich shades of scarlet and red loudly attests to the accomplishments and privileged connections held by Velasco during his tenure in New Spain. The coat of arms and escutcheoned script compete with his body for attention and serve to confirm his credentials, especially his inherited and lifelong appointment as governor of the Philippines. He provokes us with his askance look and models his European cut coat of silk and brocade. Though the cut of his coat is French, the material itself signals patterns highly prized from the galleon trade from Manila. His coat is not only his achievement, but its material design is a mnemonic for a place accessed through trans-Pacific exchanges. Let me now turn to the Tabernacle at the Mission Dolores. The Tabernacle is subsumed, nearly devoured by the ornate retablo at the back of Mission Dolores. This is church space. The Tabernacle itself is attested through the ship's manifest as coming from Manila, arriving in Mission Dolores sometime in the 1790s. We can see that the object itself is announcing multiple functions. As a tabernacle, it holds the bread and water, or after transubstantiation, the body and blood of Christ. But on its front, appearing as though encased or protected by the tabernacle, is a monstrance, where the host is placed behind the sunburst, and once raised by the Father, it transubstantiates into the body of Christ, thus providing the host for the community, the Eucharist. The tabernacle and the monstrance require two different relationships from the believers in the church. One prays to the host in the tabernacle, and one adores the host in the monstrance. These two relationships prevent one from worshiping an object and thus put one's belief and relationship in a very particular configuration. When we look at the tabernacle, there's nothing particularly Filipino about this object. We could say that the highly ornate, vibrant colored, scalloped designs may evoke a sort of Asianness to it. But Filipino in particular, there's nothing really to say. And so this object could exist both in San Francisco and somewhere far away on another coast. The monstrance itself seems to be performing in another function. As you see, as it sits on a rounded orb, so that it's sort of precarious in its situation. And it may be somehow evoking the idea of Christ as Zelator Mundi, as we see in a carved ivory figure here from somewhere in South Asia. Goa is where it was placed at one point. When we go to the back of the tabernacle, we see a small door, a small opening, which is sort of unusual for a tabernacle. There are other tabernacles that are typically accessed through the front, where the bread and the water are placed for transubstantive purposes. This one has a small door in the back. And although the tabernacle appears to be perhaps a a receptacle for storing a monstrance, it's almost impossible to get an object that large into this object, into this tabernacle. What's most interesting about the inside of the tabernacle is that it's painted and beautiful designs, multicolored. And it evokes on its surface either a ceramic, perhaps, or maybe a textured and decorated silk or some fabric. Its liturgical recommendation suggests that the interiors of tabernacles be lined with a fine cloth, either silk or cotton, in order to sort of protect or provide an environment for the Eucharist. Here we have painted designs, the top of which evokes a sort of Asian cosmology with stars and clouds and a sort of enigmatic red triangle at the top. We don't know if the artist who carved and painted the outside also did the inside. Typically, workshops separate the manufacture duties to carver, to painter, to miller, to various other tasks. So it's possible that the painter of the external was perhaps practicing or perhaps evoking something on the inside of the tabernacle. We can see that perhaps the top panel may have been purposed for another use, since we have a truncated cloud that appears, well, is this working? No. On the right side and on the top left, as though we are either seeing passing clouds above us or that it might have been part of a larger design. Along the rim of the sides of the walls, we have architectural tassels designating the internal walls as some architectural space, as though we're looking from some walled cylinder up into a sky. The designs themselves on the walls of the tabernacle aren't particularly Asian. We have these acanthus shapes that could be from any European print or from any source material that provides a sort of decorative and evocative design to signal value, to signal something of worth. Interestingly enough, we could take this as just decoration and nothing more, but it's interesting that in a small detail, which is difficult to see because it's in gold paint, there is a small bird perched on one of the branches. And so, not that we must be literal in our interpretation, but the presence of fauna and flora suggests an ecology. So we have a combination of cosmology and an ecology inside the tabernacle itself, which leads to a sort of rhetorical question. What does it mean to place into the embrasure of an Asian or distant ecology and cosmology the blood and body of Christ? Well, how does this inflect this substantive process? We can all see from closer inspection that the painted portions of the interior are much older than what seem to be blank and replaced parts of the tabernacle. What's interesting is that the tabernacle itself comes from Manila. We have ship's manifest evidence to attest to that. But the wood that has been used either to repair damage or perhaps to replace panels that may have been removed for some other purpose, it's been replaced with redwood, a local California tree, right? The Sequoia sempervirens, one of the largest and oldest trees on the Pacific coast. So now we have what could be interpreted as a blank replacement to an object, but I would rather think of the redwood not as a blank replacement, but as a local contribution of nature and site to the tabernacle in order to tie it to place. The door at the back is also made of redwood, which leads to other questions about how the object either traveled, but there was a damage during its voyage across the Pacific, somewhere along its trip from San Blas in Southern California to San Francisco, or maybe later, at some time in the Mission Dolores. I had a friend of mine who is a wood miller and a master carpenter confirmed that in fact it is redwood. Confirmed my suspicions. So now we have a sort of convergence of visual and material practices that indicate both sides of the Pacific. Looking at the tabernacle externally, we could think of it as an object that exists somewhere along the nodes of exchange, that it could return, in fact, to Manila with its redwood additions. Let me offer, in closing, this map by Vicente de Meñique, published in 1761. Vicente de Meñique was a Filipino, a member of the army in Manila. He published this atlas of maps as his dissertation. And in this map that we are offered here, he turns the world on its side in order to give us a new view of the world. Vicente de Meñique was very pro-Catholic, very pro-empire. And so we see how he enumerates the various qualities of empire throughout the geographical representation. He places the Philippines firmly at the foundation of the map, not to negate its presence, but to act as a foundation. And we can see how important this is when we see another map from the very same atlas, where he uses the very same map to overlay a representation of the Immaculate Conception. The crown at top is overlaid onto Spain. You see her body passing through the new world of New Spain, and her feet are firmly on the Philippine Islands. Her staff, which runs at an angle, is in fact the equatorial delineation, so that we see that he is providing us a new vision for a global conceptualization. And despite it being pro-Catholic and pro-empire, I'm most fascinated by the very fact that Meñique offers us a new way to calibrate how to see the world. It's also very interesting that the map itself sort of echoes or rhymes with the tabernacle. Now, I'm not saying that the map is the model for the tabernacle or as such, because the idea of the columns of Hercules, which are part of the Spanish coat of arms, which is there on the flag on the top, is also represented as pilasters here on the tabernacle, perhaps by chance. The verticality of the object, the beautiful medallion on her chest is actually a list of all of the ships that plied the galleon trade between Manila and the western coast of Mexico. Each of the folds of her dress are in fact names of ships and the qualities of the materials that they brought back and forth across the ocean. But what's really interesting about this tabernacle and this map together is that it offers an opportunity to see globalism in terms more than just trade, right? The addition of the redwood planks to the tabernacle gives us an opportunity to think of how the local contributes to the larger whole without flattening local communities, either the Manila worldview or the Ohlone practices of making into something on the periphery. We see the world here not as sections of land interrupted by water, but instead of water and its currents, which sort of control and contribute to the movement of people and objects. A globalism that's based on the very nature of the world itself. And I offer that perhaps the tabernacle and other objects that are in Mission Dolores offer a way to access new visions of globalism that can help us recalibrate how we interpret these objects. And ultimately, I want to argue for a globalism that is not marked by national territories, by national borders, but perhaps requires us to center our global view upon the planet itself and how the material and visual qualities that make up the edges of the ocean are really what connect us ultimately. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that interesting discussion. So for our final paper today, we're pleased to welcome Joanne Mancini, and her talk is Art, Architecture, and Conquest, a Trans-Pacific Perspective.
Sorry, I can't see we've lost our, oh, there you are. I can't see the screen that has the time and the, the cursor moves all on its own. It's like a ghostly presence. Well, while this is being set up, just to say thanks as well. I'm absolutely honored and flattered to be here and very happy that you've come today. Okay. All right. So I wanted to start with some images and some processes that have already been mentioned already at this conference, for example, by Professor Chavez in her very interesting talk yesterday, having to do with nostalgia and myth-making about the missions. This process is something that is, I think, familiar to many people who've looked at the missions. And I think there are various different sort of shorthands that we could use for kind of putting this together. One which I have just thrown together is ruins, nostalgia, kitsch, modernism. There's different formulations, but there's one of them. And there are many people who've commented on this, and an example would be this article, which is one of many looking at this process. And I've chosen this article by Rawls because I wanted to enlarge the caption because it reinforces a timeline, I think, that we can associate with this process of myth making and its relationship to conquest. Although I know from yesterday that maybe I shouldn't use the word conquest, but I'm going with the title of the conference, so we'll stick with that for the moment, in which we have the period of the Spanish invasion and the missions, followed by Mexican independence, followed by the secularization of the missions, followed by their abandonment, followed then by the U.S. Conquest, where it's after this point that we then have that we then begin to see this retrospective process of myth-making, of the generation of postcards and other sort of touristy things, and of sort of new commercial and other forms of culture that are using the kind of invented mission vocabulary as a way of selling things, including California itself. And that this then feeds into a related process whereby new makers in California, architects included, took this a kind of invented vocabulary and then distilled it into new forms. For example, architectural forms such as the work of Irving Gill, this being the La Jolla Women's Club of 1914 to 1915, and this is in the this photograph is in the Historic American Building Survey in the Library of Congress. And so I think this is something that lots of people have taken a look at in the past, and could be portrayed through a number of runs of images of this sort, looking at this kind of sequencing. And so I'll just give you another run here. And I won't say anything about what they are, but I'll just give you these images and thinking about that timeline. And then, so maybe we'd say ruins, then we'd say postcards, and then we'd say modernist architectural distillations of postcards based on myth-making, based on ruins. And I don't think I'm saying anything controversial to say that these last three slides that I've shown you look familiar from a California perspective, and they have something to do with our themes. Again, the themes of conquest, and again, I've used that word again, and I apologize, I'll probably use it quite a few times, art and missions. And of course, they do relate to those themes and to California and to all the things that I've been talking about. They just don't do exactly in the way that we might expect, in that they are more directly actually part of a somewhat separate but interconnected, as I'm trying to say, historical process that interrelated art and conquest, this being the United States conquest of the Philippines at the very end of the 19th century, going into the beginning of the 20th century. Insofar as the first image, insofar as this image, which I showed you with the postcards, actually comes from a scrapbook that was made by a pair of teachers who went to the Philippines during the Philippine-American War in 1901, and I emphasize the during the war part of that, in order to participate in the reformulation of the education system in the Philippines that began even as the war progressed. And the next ones relates not to a California mission, but rather to the 16th century. Is that 5 minutes? The ringing? Okay, I was just wondering. I think it is 5 minutes, actually. Sorry, the next one relates to, not to a mission in California, but rather to the ruined 16th century Augustinian mission at Guadalupe, which is in present-day Makati. Sort of at the time, it would have been outside of the city of Manila. At the time, meaning during the Philippine-American War, would have been outside the city of Manila, but nearby. Here's another, one of the other images I showed you with the helpful caption, Guadalupe ruins near Manila was a magnificent retreat for friars burned in 1899, which gives us a bit of specificity on that. And I threw in another one just because it fits into this theme of tourism, which is another view of Guadalupe, which appeared in a book called Interesting Manila by a Methodist missionary called George Amos Miller, again, another American who called Guadalupe, quote, the queen of the ruins, and encouraged people to visit it, along with other sites such as cemeteries, which he tended to describe for their gruesomeness because of the fact that there would have been communal ossuaries and only the temporary use of niche graves, and then people's remains would tend to be removed if they didn't continue to pay rent for the use of niche graves into communal ossuaries, and this offended his sensibility for, offended his Protestant sensibility and also his sense of there being a proprietary connection that it was desirable for people to have a piece of property after death as well as in life. But I don't want to get too carried away with that, although I might come back to this if I have time. And then finally, the other image that I showed you also comes from this context of the Philippines, and it is, in fact, not by Irving Gill, although it looks a lot like Irving Gill. It's indeed William Parsons' Philippine General Hospital, which is no longer extant because it was destroyed during the Second World War. Now, I introduced these parallel sets of images to make a basic, but I think under-recognized point. And that's that the intertwined history of conquest and the arts in California, including this sort of myth-making that I think we know a lot about, is connected to another history, that being the history of the United States conquest in the Philippines. And I have a little map here just to sort of give us a little flavor of that from a visual perspective. And I would say that it's connected, first off, in terms of personnel, such as Luther Parker, who, as I mentioned before, carried postcards of the California missions to the Philippines, as well as a postcard of a mission in Guam as well, also part of the U.S. Military move into the Pacific at the time. These were carried by Parker on his way to the Philippines, on his way to play a role in the imposition of U.S. rule. Parker, who I should say grew up in California, although he wasn't born in California, and who apparently spent some time teaching at an Indian school in Oregon before going to the Philippines, where he was able to rise in the post-conquest U.S. educational administration to become an industrial inspector with the Bureau of Education. And I should say, just to say a few words about the U.S. educational system and its relationship to some of the things that we've looked at so far in the last couple of days, having to do with handicrafts, for example, having to do with the way that they're disrupted or used in various ways in the context of I don't want to say conquest again, so I won't. But in the context of empire, I suppose. And that is to say that in the case of the United States, that the Bureau of Education, which he was an inspector for, actually had its own sales division for handicrafts that were produced by school children. And as you can see from the colored postcard there, this is actually an image of young women in the context of school creating embroidery. And these were actually put up for sale, and catalogs were made to try to encourage people to buy handicrafts made by pupils who, of course, were compelled to attend school. There was actually compulsory education, which leads to a sort of strange and slightly uncomfortable situation. And I would say that there's a parallel then. Maybe it's a stretched parallel, but one that I'm going to try to make as well, in the sense that in U.S. prisons in the time, for example, in Bilibid prison in Manila, that this was also a similar thing where prisoners were made to make things, either industrial products or, in some cases, less commonly handicrafts, and they were also put up for sale. Okay. Oh, while I'm on the topic of Parker, who's I don't know whether he was typical or not, but I'll mention another thing about him is that he was also involved in, actually, do you know what? I'm going to skip that because I don't want to digress too much. And I realize that I'm going to run way over time if I allow myself to digress too much. Okay, so these two things are connected. That is to say, California and perhaps even the California missions, or the romanticization, visualization of them, to the U.S. conquest of the Philippines in other ways. As well, and in fact quite intimately, in the sense that if we look at California at this time, we can see that in addition to being the source, for example, of teachers and other personnel who went to the Philippines, that it was also in San Francisco the major port of embarkation for U.S. troops going to the Philippines. In addition to this, California, along with other Western states, was the home state of the bulk of troops who fought in the Philippine-American War, for example, the 1st California Volunteers. And I should say California as well as other Western states, but California is definitely highly represented in this. As such, having said that, it can be said that Californians were quite extensively represented as practitioners of conquest in the Philippines. In other words, as people who were waging war on behalf of the United States in order to turn the Philippines into an American colony. At the same time, however, Californians were also the practitioners of art in the Philippines, simultaneous to their roles as soldiers and as other imperial personnel in the Philippines. And so one of the things that I have found quite interesting in researching this is that it was quite frequently the case that that we see Californians and as well as other U.S. soldiers immediately taking the opportunity when they were in the Philippines, particularly between the interwar period between the Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War, to do things like visit and critique Manila's landmark architectural sites, including churches including churches that had been built as mission churches, including visits to arsenals and other military installations built by the Spanish, and so on and so forth. And this included personnel from California. We also see soldiers, again, from California as well as other places, participating in other kinds of art processes, as, for example, the makers of images. And again, I think we tend to see war photography as being somewhat separate from the practice of war, in the sense that we tend to think of photographic practitioners as not necessarily being soldiers themselves, but in some cases we have people who were actually both, as well as somewhat more conventionally people who served as embedded photographers. An example here would be Pearlie Fremont Rocket, who, as far as I understand, was from San Francisco, and who took this image, which is of the U.S. occupation of the Augustinian Mission Church at Pasig. Again, that would be just outside the then boundaries of the city of Manila. Another example would be the post photographer of the Presidio in San Francisco, James Givens, who also went to the Philippines and took a number of photographs at this time. So we see then there's kind of a role that was played by military personnel in what we might think of as art practices. Now, having said this, what I would want to emphasize is that I don't just mean that people who were military or imperial personnel were engaged just in acts of representation when I say art practice, although that's important. What I would also say, and what I think also needs to be emphasized, is that they tended also to be involved in what we might think of as less representational or less discursive practices that were associated both with art and with war, such as looting, which was quite extensive during the Philippine-American War. Obviously, I don't have pictures of this, of actual looting, but this is one location that was well established to have seen some looting, and this is at San Pedro Macati. As well as architectural destruction, including the burning of the Augustinian Mission Church at Guadalupe, which I began with. Sorry, my images are slightly not in the order that I thought they were, but you sort of get the idea what I'm talking about here. Oh, I know what slide I'm missing. I'm missing, so these images are from Guadalupe, but there are also ones from another church called Paco, which I thought was in here, but it isn't, so I'll have to get back to that in a moment. Now, having brought us to the topic of the burning of former mission churches by of the burning of mission churches by, or former mission churches in the Philippines by U.S. personnel, I want to dwell on that and the images associated with that act for a couple of reasons. The first is to make a second point, or I suppose to kind of get into a second topic, along with the previous general idea that there's an interconnection between California and the missions, at least as they're imagined and visualized, and the conquest of the Philippines. And that's to say that the kind of geographical experiment that I've been engaging in here, in expanding our framework beyond California to the Philippines, that it also does something to the timeline that I started with, and the timeline that I think we have for California, to this shorthand that I began with of ruins, nostalgia, then kitsch-stroke tourism, then perhaps modernism or the creation of new kinds of buildings, et cetera. And that is to say that in the Philippines, this timeline is compressed in a way that is different to the way things were in California. So that the first images of ruins that I showed you in the Philippines are actually from 1899. And then by 1906, so only a few short years later, we get to the kind of images in the context of tourism, the middle one again being Beatty's image of the arches at Guadalupe, trying to convince people to visit the ruins of Guadalupe as a tourist destination, describing it again as the queen of the ruins. And then already by 1910, so really only a decade later, we already have this kind of distillation of the ruins represented thus into new forms with this Parsons image that I showed you. Now, so there is a compression then in terms of this familiar timeline. But more than that, I think that what I need to emphasize is that it's not just a compression, but rather something that I still can't completely get to grips with, and that I think I can only describe as being a bit weird. And that is that, unlike in California, where we start off with the idea that the missions were already ruined in the time of the US conquest, and that then there's a kind of retrospective reimagining. In the Philippines, this isn't the case, in the sense that when US troops arrived in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War in 1898, and indeed at the end of the Spanish-American War as well, Guadalupe was not a ruin. It was actually a fully existing structure that had not been burned down, and that in fact was, like the Paco Church, which I'll also mention closer to Manila, was actually in use and was part of a culture in which, with the exception, well, at least in the Manila region, was overwhelmingly Catholic. And so we're not actually talking about, a sort of process of ruination and then retrospection, but rather, really what we have taking place is that the ruins are made by, in this case, the California troops, and then immediately become the objects of postcards, and then immediately become sites for tourism, and then almost immediately after that get sort of built into new buildings. Now, when we get to the, and then I'll just give you back just one more time to look at the caption again of the Beatty image. Guadalupe ruins near Manila was a magnificent retreat for friars, burned in 1899, and this is actually almost exactly after it was burned by the US troops. Okay, so when we get then to the other church that I wanted to mention, the Paco Church, which is closer to Manila, but again, in the Manila region, things get even stranger because in this case, unlike in the case of Guadalupe, where we don't, at least from the United States perspective, we don't have a before image showing the church and the convent in an unruined state. In the case of Paco, we actually do. And what's weird is that here it is published in a book with the telling, and I'd say slightly insane title of Our Islands and Their People as Seen with Camera and Pencil. In this case, it's actually the personal copy of Jack London, which is in the Huntington Library, where you can see this structure, sort of fully formed. But then if you look at the caption, it says, occupied by Filipinos and burnt during a battle with the 1st California Regiment. So this is published actually kind of as the Philippine-American War is still going on. The church is already destroyed, but this is the image which is published in a book which is circulated quite widely in the United States, with the caption telling us that the church has already been destroyed, but it's this kind of impossible before image, which is being published in this way. And then if we actually look at it, we can see that there was actually, so this is indeed, the source image for this was an image by the US photographer John Kress, who also took the after image, which you can see in the center. And then here's the published version that was sent back to the United States. Now, helpfully, I have a timer which says I have 2 minutes and 24 seconds later. 2 minutes and 24 seconds left. So I won't go on and on about the rest of the things that I wanted to talk about, but I did just want to say that, just in case anyone would be interested in hearing how this all potentially relates back to the period of the California missions themselves, I would say that there is actually a connection in the sense that I was very intrigued yesterday to hear the lecture about geopolitics and the way that that Baja California plays a role in terms of anxieties about the British encroachment into the Pacific and all of that, because I think that clearly a case could be made for that for the missions in Upper California as well. And indeed, what is interesting from my perspective is that we also see this process being played out in the Philippines in a variety of ways, having to do with things which took place at the very having to do with the construction of this church, which was burned by U.S. troops in 1899, where what we see just very briefly in the 59 seconds that I have left is the fact that this is actually a church which was originally built as a mission church in very close to the city walls of Manila, and then is actually cleared along with essentially the entire the entirety of the extramural settlements on the outsides of the city walls of Manila, including many neighborhoods that would have been predominantly inhabited by Filipinos, as well as by the religious orders and the missions that they had built in those areas as a result of the 7 Years' War. And so we get to the, sorry, I just want to get to the final image. And so we get to the, oops, I don't actually have the image that I was going to show you. Okay. And so we get, oh, okay, sorry, I'm missing another image. And so we get to the movement of that church to the location where it was when it was burnt by California forces. Okay, so I'm definitely out of time, so I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to plug my book, and I'm going to say thank you again, and thank you for your patience in letting me go on and on. Cheers.
Okay. All right. So we have time for discussion. Maybe we could, depending on how it goes, we can do 15 minutes or so, and then save maybe 5 minutes before the lunch break so Gauvin can show us the website resource that he's been working on and share with us. So do we have questions from the... I don't have a football.
Thank you very much. My question is for Ramón. I really enjoyed your presentation, and I wanted to ask if the conclusion where you got to on how we should be thinking about a global history seen from, well, and the perspective of, like the oceans. Apologies if I didn't quite got it, but it's something that I see you got from your experience of working like very intensive object history with the Tabernacle. My specific question is, like, did that view of history, did your view of global history is something that arise from the study of the Tabernacle, or is it something that you had sort of worked out before and you applied it to the Tabernacle?
It is actually, I have to confess, something I've worked out considerably to try to think through histories of objects. I guess I should precurse that with the very idea of this being a Philippine object already sort of places it in a very specific site. But in fact, that tabernacle could have gone from Manila to perhaps Goa, or gone to some other place along the routes of not only exchange but Catholic, very very particular Catholic objects that fulfill certain requirements, right? That have very specific designs to be in networks of Catholicism, but also of exchange and trade. And so the idea that it's particularly Philippine is interesting, but I want to sort of unmoor it from a specific site to see how, as we see, it's in Mission Dolores in San Francisco. So it sort of resonates differently than if we saw it in a church in Manila, or if we saw it in a church in Kochi, or a church in Goa. And so this is part of my larger project to try to get at the visual material that's both local but also available to be considered from other perspectives. That's rambling, sorry.
Can I piggyback on the answer? My question to you, Ramón, is that is a very curious object. That these are Franciscans or Jesuits that are
Franciscans.
Franciscans. Okay, so
San Francisco.
So here you have Franciscans who are bringing in a tabernacle that it's unremarkably Filipino in all sorts of ways. The materials, nothing points out to a Filipino origins. That could have been done in that mission. It could have been done by the Franciscans, by the natives, and yet it's kind of imported. That is odd. Why would they bring this object that could have been easily been made locally from the Philippines? That is one question, and I have a question for Gauvin, but I don't know whether.
Yeah, so I think from research and the scholarship is that there's this idea that churches have objects that sort of catch the eyes of the indigenous communities, because by engaging, the idea, if I can frame it this way, the idea is that by visually engaging a body, you then capture their mind, and then ultimately you save their soul. And so I think perhaps Asian objects in the Mission Dolores might be a sort of convergence of two desires. One, to bring interesting objects into the church to perform these functions. And the other may be a sort of desire to participate in those trans-Pacific exchanges. I mean, there's a lot of intent that I don't know. We know some of the details of how it happened. The tabernacle and other objects are in the ship's manifest. They're sort of distributed across California, with the tabernacle winding up in.
But you wanted something exotic.
Something, yeah. So the difficulty is that I don't quite know what exotic means in the mind of Father Cambon. Right, or in the minds of the Franciscan Brotherhood, and a lot of Father Cambon and Palau are Spaniards who come all the way to Mexico and then to the coast of Alta California. So their ideas of exoticism are probably they probably share the same sort of ideas about what that may mean, but their experiences have been inflected through their experiences of the indigenous communities in Mexico, all sorts of things. But I wonder ultimately, one, why Asian objects for Father Cambon, And others, like, where did he get the money, right? So there's going and buying crates and crates of Asian stuff to bring back to San Francisco is the community of Ohlone people in San Francisco was not that large. As a matter of fact, Camboa and Palau are sort of admonished by Junipero Serra, saying that you don't have enough people here to support, I'm guessing, not only the saving of souls, but the financial foundation. Like, you need more bodies because you need to generate more, stuff. So I'm rambling now. I don't know if I answered your question.
Oh, yeah, well, for you. Should I ask a question or?
Sure, and then we have a question.
Well, the question is for Gauvin, so what? You have this German guy who comes in and does this thing, and as expected, and you tell us about this Madonna, and the Madonna disappears, and my question remains, I mean, and so what is the significance of knowing this stuff? Besides the fact that, there is a German influence in the architecture of the missions that kind of disappears, apparently, because the Germans suck at building.
What's important about it, what's interesting about it, is that it's an alternate European idea of conquest imposed upon the Spanish Empire. A specifically Germanic one, often very dramatically expressed through things like raising crosses with the word Germany on it. That shows that we need to complicate our ideas of what these missions, who's coming in, the personnel of the missions, not just the personnel, but what kinds of ideologies from their local regions they bring in. In this case, someone from Tyrol who, despite coming from Tyrol, was actually rather more proud of coming from Bavaria, and what kinds of preconceptions, and it's an anachronistic word, but what kinds of propaganda is he bringing in to apply to the Guarani missions? And yes, it failed, but then so did most of them. But it's an alternative.
Any following apparently among the Guarani?
For a while, but not very long. It was more about him. It was more what he wanted to show off to his countrymen. It's more about pride in Germany, homesickness, whatever, glorifying the Wittelsbach dynasty overseas. I don't think the Guarani really cared that much who it was, and I don't think the interest lasted very long at all. I mean, there's no evidence it did.
But it was a dark Madonna. You could have taken rules differently, as it did with many other objects.
It was a dark Madonna story. I didn't catch the rest.
That it was a dark Madonna.
Yeah.
That seems interesting in and of itself.
Yeah.
The perspective of Guarani culture, perhaps.
Perhaps, but it was a dark Madonna before it left. I think the dark Madonna had more to do with Loreto cult and had more to do with Europe, actually, than with indigenous America. I think the really important thing for indigenous America in his crazy mind, and this idea that he was bringing, this ideology he was bringing to do with Alt-Oettingen, was its connection with sort of early Christian victories against paganism in Germany, and then this symbolized what he hoped to do, bringing Christianity to the indigenous Americas. I don't think the black face of the Virgin had anything to do with it.
So he's recapitulating the defeat of the pagans.
Exactly. He's really reliving a Carolingian episode.
Hi. I think that all your papers were very interesting because for me, missions are in the present places for cultural dialogue. So I think that all of your papers actually show the complexity of the cultural networks that were in place within the history of the missions. And I'm an archaeologist and a restorer, so I have two questions for Ramón and for you. I didn't pick up your name, sorry.
Joanne?
Joanne. The first one is about because I think, Ramón, that your paper shows the potential of object-oriented analysis to unveil the relationships between many communities in material terms. So I was wondering about the significance of the red oak in the Tabernacle, because of course it was a local product. However, the question is, what's this, the meaning of that? It was, I mean, in terms of production, in terms of the meaning of the object. I mean, of course, these are very difficult questions. And for that reason, I would like to know a little bit more about perhaps the usage of red oak within the indigenous communities. I mean, is this was a product that it was used to produce a sculpture within indigenous communities? I mean, what are the implications of this local product within the tabernacle?
Thank you. It's actually redwood, which is a
redwood.
sequoia tree, right? So I didn't get into this. I got flustered, most likely. So the idea being that redwood is an indigenous tree to the California coast. The Ohlone people were the labor that built the mission. The painted ceiling that you see in one of those images, that entire thing is made of redwood, painted redwood. So the idea being that the person who was crucial to making the quarter sawn planks to replace of the tabernacle was likely an Ohlone person who worked the material. And so I apologize, I don't know much about the sort of relationships to trees in Ohlone culture, but the sequoia tree is one of the oldest and largest on the Pacific coast. And in my mind, such a large and prominent and dominant entity, this tree, must hold some importance, right, into the sort of world view, the ecological, environmental perceptions of the indigenous people, both the Miwok, everyone along that Pacific Northwest. So in a sense, the redwood as a contribution to the construction of the tabernacle now places my imagined sort of world conceptions, perhaps mythologies, material and visual relationships of the indigenous community to a very important tree. And that when an Ohlone person perhaps looks inside the tabernacle, they will not only see the painted surfaces, the cotton lines backing of part of the tabernacle, but they'll see the grain of the redwood, right? And it has a redwood, when it's cut in a quarter sawn way, has a certain visual quality that sometimes shines and reflects light in a very specific way. So the material qualities are all read together, I think, by a particular person and maker, in my mind.
Yes, because at some point I thought that it was perhaps a restoration, a historical restoration, but it's very significant it was not painted over.
Yeah, yes, that's very significant considering, I mean, there is a lot of unpainted redwood from very early in the construction of Mission Dolores, but that entire ceiling is covered redwood. I mean, there are other parts of the structure, the pillar posts that support the serpentine stair at the rear of the church is hand-hewn redwood, and you can tell the difference between something that's been milled smooth and something that's been hand-factured from the redwood. And so the redwood itself exists in various forms and states. So it's contributing visually and materially to the mission itself, and in particular this tabernacle.
Thank you. And Joanna, I wanted to ask you about to what extent the missions were actually in a state of a ruin at the beginning of the century. I mean, is this Dolores, was the Dolores mission, the mission that you talk about that it was ruined? Was this a particular case, or do you have information about the other missions where?
Do you mean in the Philippines or do you mean in California?
Pardon? No, no, I'm sorry. I'm talking in California.
In California.
Uh-huh.
Mission Dolores was not, no, but it was exceptional in that it was in a much better preserved state than the other ones. And that's the image that I showed wasn't Mission Dolores, but
So
yeah.
what was the name of the mission that you showed?
I actually have to look at the caption.
Yeah,
'cause I
well,
don't
that
remember.
one, that
Because
one
I
that you
had a lot
showed.
of problems with my images, and so I was cutting and yeah, you know the story. So yeah.
So my question is whether this was just the worst ruin, or all the missions
Okay.
were also destroyed.
Yeah, you mean like how much reconstruction there was? Well, it really depends. I mean, there were some that were like basically rebuilt from the bottom up. I mean, I'm really not an expert on that,
Okay.
But that is something that there's actually an extensive literature about the way that the missions that were in a ruined state in California were sort of created, you know, from the ground up in some cases into in California. Yeah, and I mean there would be a literature on that, and so if you wanted to look into that, like there's lots of things to, you know, and that's certainly not a point that's original with me. That's why I mentioned it. So as being kind of a part of the backdrop, I suppose.
That seems like a very significant point.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What?
And it's connected to Ramon's.
But Mission Dolores is exceptional though, because it's not in that state. It's in fact the one that's in the best. It's in the best condition. It's in the best condition of them all. Yeah, and indeed, even during the earthquake in 1906, it remains intact with the earthquake, even though and it was preserved from the fire as well. So yeah, but it would be kind of a counterexample to many of the other ones. Yeah.
So I think we have time for one final conversation. Yeah, Clara.
I just want to, I thought this was a wonderful panel, I guess because I'm an art historian, art and architectural historian, but I think it illustrates the richness of the information that can be gleaned from buildings, actual buildings and objects, and how much work we need to do to be able to really take advantage of the works we have. And then, of course, this last discussion is also a clear evidence of the need to look again, reconsider. There's some things we're probably not going to know, but the more we look and the more we deal with these objects and with their materials and so forth and so on, the more we're going to understand. And I think this is an enormous need, especially of the California missions.
Do we have time? So we have a few minutes before lunch, so we'll just dig into lunch a little bit if you don't mind, so we can see this resource here.
I'll just put this up here so people can hear. Oh, you already have it. Excellent.
Okay.
Now, am I going to be able to?
We don't know.
Yes, okay. So I just want to introduce a website that I designed with some of my students in 2015. It's now been funded twice by the NEH and twice by the Canadian equivalent called SHIRK. It is still in a stage where we're building and building. It has over 20,000 pictures of colonial architecture around the world. Mostly they're still mine, but we're building on bringing in stuff from not just students and ex-students, but also colleagues. In fact, someone I just signed on is a Lonely Planet travel writer. And the way it says, the reason I did it in the first place is because I wanted to do two things. First of all, buildings from the colonial world. Oh, this is the British Empire for some reason. Let's go back to the home page. Right, so this is the home page. Very sensitive mouse here. Be nice to the mouse. There we go. So the idea at first was, okay, these buildings are very hard to find pictures of online, especially good architectural details. So that's just a very practical thing. But also, we want to record these buildings, a great proportion of which are UNESCO heritage sites, but also a great proportion of which are either damaged or in danger or in fact destroyed. In fact, I have a keyword for that. I just want to show you briefly how it works. So, for example, French Empire, you get various different regions of the French Empire, and then you, like for Haiti, for example, it's under domestic, military, and civic, and then in some cases I put post-independence period. But let's go on religious, and Cap-Patient, the cathedral there, Notre Dame, I mean, look, it already has over 1,000 hits. So this site is really getting a lot of attention. I'm getting a lot of people writing to me. And the idea is, again, to connect the study of colonial architecture across fields, because people who do French Empire don't tend to do Spanish Empire, don't tend to do British Empire. And so one of the things I have, this mouse is really, oh, first of all, I should tell you, every single one is geotagged, and you can geotag the whole thing. This actually will give you a range. So they are all geotagged. There are parts that are more populated than others. So it's very, very heavily populated in South America and the Caribbean. Pretty good for Mexico, but not great. Also North America, pretty good in Africa. Really, really heavy duty in Southeast Asia and South Asia, some in Australia. But also when you go within these different empires, so let's choose an empire. Let's go to the Dutch Empire. Why not go to the Spanish? Yes, let's go to the Spanish Empire. Thank you. If I can get this mouse to work, we can do that. All right, okay. Yeah, I know, I can see it, but I can't get to it. Spanish Empire, there we go. So I've done them according to the colonial divisions with some, oh, this mouse is driving me nuts. Is there a mouse mat? They don't make these here anymore, do they? With some, yeah, this is better. So I use the colonial names, but I've also added for the general public some assistance like Dominican Republic and Mexico, USA for Viceroyalty of New Spain, South America, Viceroyalty of Peru. I just say Southern South America because when you click on it, you get Argentina and Uruguay, which after 1776 is Rio de Plata, but most of the buildings are earlier. Paraguay, Chile, Peru. Probably most of them are in Peru. You go to religious, you go to all these different regions, Arequipa, Ayacucho, Cajamarca, but let's go to Arequipa. So, and then you eventually get to an actual building. And each building, and this is super important for me as a historian, and I have really made an effort for this, every single building, just going to try to move this down again with this mouse, every single building has a date. Wherever possible, it has an architect, and if it's a UNESCO heritage site, I've put that too. So one of my big beefs in this field is it's very hard to find dates, even in scholarly literature. So I've gone to a great deal of trouble to date everything. Now let's go to the keywords. So we can go home, go down to the keywords. Oh, you wanted to see, yeah, the Spanish Empire. So Spanish Empire, we can do the geo thing, and of course I got the Philippines in there, but most of it obviously is from here. And then if you want to go to Viceroyalty of Peru, it narrows down, etc., and the individual monument you can also, and then go on Google Street View if you want to see what it looks like today. Let's go back to home, go to the keywords. So I have keywords, for example, since we're talking about indigenous groups here, Mohawk. We'll bring up buildings in Canada and New England that are related to the Mohawks, and these all come up, and some of them very important monuments, very early period. If we go back, like Neo-Gothic, we get Neo-Gothic from Pakistan here, from Macau, from Montreal, from Bombay, from all different places. And it won't say it here, but there's like 30 pages of these. There's also a keyword for, yeah, let's do mission. Mission, I know there's like 28 pages. Left. That left, all right. So missions, okay, so we have, and I'm afraid what it actually throws up here is somewhat arbitrary, but we're starting, we have the, Cotahuasi Canyon in Peru, then suddenly we have Mexico, more Cotahuasi Canyon. So it's throwing them in sort of an odd order, but come on, mouse. And each of these brings up things that are elsewhere in, like you have Argentina here, we have Chiloé and Chile. Later on we'll get into the Protestant areas, but Nercon, this is Chiloé, this is the Iruja and Salta. Which doesn't seem to want to click. And come on. Cholula, and then Collao. We've got some Paraguay there. Next. And so on and so forth. So lots and lots of missions. I just also wanted to point out the keyword for destroyed or endangered, because this is a very sad one, but see how big it is? So these are buildings that are either in real danger of collapse or actually have destroyed. The Graneros Church I shot a few weeks before it was destroyed in the Chilean 2010 earthquake. Some of these ones in Coca Canyon were destroyed in the 2000s or damaged, heavily damaged. Some of them have been rebuilt, but many of them not. Others are gone forever. Others, like these ones in Jakarta, are very close to being gone. I just want to show you something kind of ironic from... We're done? We're done. So you got the idea. Colonial Architecture Project. And please feel free to look through that.
Thank you.
Can we use the photographs?
Yeah. So at the beginning, I had them all, what do you call it, watermarks. Then I realized, no, this is supposed to be an educational thing. So I've taken all the watermarks off. Everyone is free for educational purposes, for study purposes, to use the images, just do a screen cap. If you want a better one, you just write to me and I'll send you one. Like I had someone. Yeah. Republican. So I had someone from who's writing a book on Paraguay, UT Austin, I think, wanted some pictures of Capiatá, and so I just sent it to them.
Thank you. I'm going to end the conversation out of respect for the other speakers, because we have a lot of people today.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That looks like an amazing resource. So we're breaking for lunch. We have a workshop at 1:30. We're going to start promptly because we have a lot of speakers this afternoon. There are a number of restaurants. There's a restaurant in this building, and there are a number of restaurants on campus, and there are maps at the entrance hall. The speakers have a working lunch. Sorry, you're not off the hook. So the speakers are going to go downstairs to the entrance, and then we'll show you where that is. So thank you very much for an amazing morning. I really appreciate everyone's papers today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll be back here about 1:15, 1:20.